Hello. Okay, I'm Gyan Prakash. I'm a historian. I teach in the history department, and I'm chairing this session. I'm thankful to Max for asking me to chair. And in fact, when he asked me to chair and I said yes, he sent me a text back which said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Uh, and it tells you something about what he's been going through with respect to this conference. That even chairing a session apparently requires some courage. Um, so we have a session on the panel on Zionism Third World, and we couldn't have even imagined two better panelists. Professor Joel Beinin, who's Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University, where he's taught a lot. He really doesn't need an introduction. He's written so many really important and well-known books on Israeli left. Um, and I feel like, although I've never met him, but I feel like I know him because Zach Lockman, okay. Yeah, so Zach Lockman, who was here at Princeton, and he did a lot of work with you, and he often spoke about you. So anyway, he's written a number of books on Israeli left, including some with and on Palestinian struggle, including Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, which was co-edited with Zach Lockman. And our second panelist, who unfortunately couldn't be here, who's also a co-organizer of the conference, is Professor Esmat Elhalaby, who's assistant professor of transnational history at the University of Toronto, and whose forthcoming book is called Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine and India at the Dawn of Decolonization, which will come out of University of California Press in September. So I'll invite Professor Beinin to first offer his remarks.
Thank you, Gyan. Thank you, Max, for your brilliant introductory comments. Thanks also to Josh Guild, who reminded us of the importance of witness and refusal, which is actually connected both to my paper and how it is that I came to be able to write it. I came to reject Zionism when I was living in Israel in the early 1970s, and one of the important impetuses to that was my solidarity with and action with a group of Israeli Mizrahi Jews, that is, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, who called themselves the Israeli Black Panthers. And they very consciously looked to the American Black Panther Party, which scared the living daylights out of the Israeli establishment. So that tradition of black refusal, black struggle, black witness is also part of my paper today, because Matzpen, the Israeli Socialist Organization, was one of the few Israeli organizations that stood forthwith with the Black Panthers of Israel. So here we go. The Israeli Socialist Organization, or ISO, later the Socialist Organization in Israel, and commonly known as Matzpen or Compass, after the name of its Hebrew magazine, was established in 1962 by a small group, originally mostly Jews, who had left or been expelled from the Communist Party of Israel, Maki as the acronym. The formation of the organization was primarily driven by the international context, the persistence of Stalinist-style politics in the Soviet Union and local communist parties, the Sino-Soviet split, the reactionary stands of communists in Cuba and Algeria, and the global movement of decolonization. Only subsequently did the ISO's analysis of Zionism as a settler colonial movement become the organization's distinctive and central feature. There were never more than several score members of Matzpen, including all the factions into which it split in the 1970s. Arguably, Matzpen had far greater influence on the international New Left's understanding of Israel-Palestine than on Israeli or Palestinian political life. However, no other Israeli political organization ever developed or thought it was as important to develop a comprehensive critique of the hegemony of Zionist ideology in Israel. Following the Nakba, Palestine no longer designated a recognized political unit. In the discourse of international affairs, Palestinian Arabs were typically reduced from the majority national community in British Mandate Palestine to Arab refugees. In the early 1950s, Palestinian Fidaiyin began attacking Israeli soldiers and civilians from refugee camps in Syria, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. This was the pretext for the Israeli government colluding with France and Britain in the 1956 tripartite aggression against Egypt. But the Suez-Sinai War also confirmed the transmutation of the Palestinian Zionist struggle into an Arab-Israeli conflict in which the principal actors were the Arab states and Israel, who agreed only on thwarting autonomous expressions of Palestinian nationalism and the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The Communist Party of Israel, Maki, reunited Arabs and Jews who had belonged to the several factions of the Communist Party of Palestine, which had splintered on mostly ethno-national lines in the last decade of the British Mandate. After the 1948 war, Maki, in principle, continued to uphold the validity of the UN partition plan and the right of Palestinian Arabs to self-determination in an independent state. In practice, however, Maki's work among the 156,000 Palestinian Arabs who became citizens of Israel focused on defending their rights to their lands and livelihoods and their political and civil rights, most prominently opposition to the military government that governed their lives from 1949 to 1966. In 1961, two leading founders of Matzpen, Moshe Machover and Akiva Or, published a book under the pseudonym A. Yisraeli entitled Peace, Peace, and There Is No Peace. The title is a quote from the book of Jeremiah. They originally planned to show that Israel's participation in the British and French invasion of Egypt in 1956 was not a war of no choice, as the Israeli government and most of the public in Israel insisted, but rather a contrived war and an integral part of Ben-Gurion's policy. He preferred alliances with colonial powers over compromises with the Arabs. This statement of purpose accepts the reframing of the question of Palestine as a state-to-state Arab-Israeli conflict. Researching their book led Machover and Or to recognize that, quote, the Israeli-Arab conflict is in substance an outcome of the problem of Palestine, unquote. Nonetheless, the book accepts the line of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement that the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was a struggle for Israeli liberation from British imperialism. It contains no fundamental critique of Zionism. About a year after the ISO was established, Jabra Nicola, a Palestinian Arab, joined the group. He had been a member of the Palestine Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s, led the Revolutionary Communist League, the Palestinian affiliate of the Trotskyist Fourth International. Soon after, Nicola, a Haifa-based group that had been expelled from Maki, including Nicola's Jewish wife, Aliza Novik, also joined Matzpen. Their statement on the occasion criticized Maki's lack of internal democracy and refusal to debate issues of revolution and reform raised by the Sino-Soviet conflict, but it also mentioned no issues directly related to Israel-Palestine. Reflecting the political origins of its founders in Maki, the ISO's initial positions on Israel-Palestine called for, quote, recognition of the national rights of the two peoples of the land of Israel, the Jewish and the Arab, unquote. Matzpen argued that the question of Palestine had not been resolved because, quote, Israel and Jordan divided between them the territory that belongs to the Arabs of Palestine, both the private property of individuals and the homeland of an entire nation were forcibly taken away from them, but the nation itself did not disappear and still exists, unquote. Therefore, Israel should, quote, abolish immediately the military government, declare publicly that it is ready to return to the Arabs of Palestine what was taken away from them in 1948, recognize their rights as individuals and as a nation, and help them acquire political independence and remove the yoke of King Hussein, unquote. An agreement between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, they argued, could resolve the conflict and normalize Israel's relations with its Arab neighbors. The ISO did not identify Zionist ideology as an issue until the second half of 1964. In the context of offering critical support for Al-Ard, the land, an Arab nationalist movement of Palestinian citizens of Israel that was eventually stamped out by the Israeli state's repressive apparatuses, Meir, the pseudonym of Meir Smorodinsky, wrote, Palestine experienced a special type of colonialism, the colonialism of the Zionist movement. Ordinary colonialism is not interested in displacing the local inhabitants. On the contrary, it is interested in them as a source of cheap labor, as a source of exploitation. Therefore, in all the colonies, the settlers were a small minority that controlled the majority of the inhabitants of the land. The Zionist settlement movement is different. Its goal was to dispossess the previous inhabitants in order to establish a Jewish state. Ordinary colonialism aimed at exploiting the treasures of the land, while Zionist colonialism aimed at the land itself. Smorodinsky was one of the first Matzpen members to publicly express the view that Zionism and the State of Israel were a settler colonial phenomenon, although he did not employ that precise terminology, which was not yet widely used by either scholars or political actors. Lacking that analysis, Smorodinsky believed that Zionist settler colonialism was completely exceptional. He excluded, for example, South Africa from the category of settler colonialism on the grounds that whites did not expel black Africans, even though under certain circumstances they did. The ISO founders agreed that Nicola was responsible for shifting their understanding of the Palestine question from that of a national conflict to a struggle between colonizers and colonized. In Aaron Torbiner's film, which anybody can see for free on the internet, Matzpen, Anti-Zionist Israelis, Machover explained. He remembered, that is Jabbar Nicola, from his own experience, things we knew only from books. In particular, a vital period of the Zionist colonization process was for him a living memory. But more important than this, he had exactly what we lacked, a coherent conception of the Zionist colonization process, and in particular, the way it affected the Arab society in Palestine. From him, we got a much better and deeper understanding of Israel as an embodiment of Zionist colonization. Also, he had a conception of the Arab Revolution as one indivisible process. Following the Trotskyist theoretical tradition, Nicola had long believed and convinced Matzpen that the resolution of the question of Palestine required a socialist revolution throughout the Arab East and not simply establishing an independent Palestinian state between the river and the sea. On May 18th, 1967, as Israel and Egypt were on the brink of war, the General Union of Palestinian Students organized a Palestine Day to commemorate the Nakba at the Maison de la Mutualité in Paris. At that event, Nathan Weinstock, a Belgian Jewish Trotskyist, read to some 500 attendees Matzpen's first statement for an international audience on the Palestine problem and the Arab-Israeli dispute. It featured 3 planks that became the ideological hallmarks of the ISO and in various forms the groupuscles that splintered from it in the 1970s. First, in language that the ISO soon ceased to use, the problem of Israel and the Israeli-Arab conflict is not an ordinary national conflict between 2 peoples. It is insufficient to call for coexistence based on mutual recognition of the just national rights of both peoples. The State of Israel is the result of the colonization of Palestine by the Zionist movement at the expense of the Arab people and under the auspices of imperialism. Second, the State of Israel should be de-Zionized and transformed into a socialist state by abolishing the law of return that allows all Jews to come to Israel and become citizens, and all other laws that discriminate against Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. Palestinian refugees should have the right to return, their property should be restored, and those who choose not to return should receive compensation for their property. The de-Zionized State of Israel should be integrated into a socialist confederation of the Middle East. Third, and this is a longish quote for which I apologize, as a result of Zionist colonization, a Hebrew nation was created in Palestine with its own national characteristics. This nation has a capitalist class structure. It has exploiters and exploited, a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. That this nation was created artificially and at the expense of the local Arab population does not change the fact that the Hebrew nation exists. If the problem of the existence of this nation is not properly resolved, then a dangerous and prolonged national conflict will once again arise. The Israeli masses will not free themselves from the influence of Zionism and will not fight against it if the progressive forces in the Arab world do not present them with a perspective of coexistence, not national oppression. Therefore, the Israeli Socialist Organization believes that a true solution to the Palestine problem requires recognition of the right of self-determination of the Hebrew nation, unquote. Because Matzpen envisaged the resolution of the question of Palestine within an Arab regional framework, it sought to find Arab partners beyond the borders of the State of Israel. In 1964, Machover and Orr relocated to London to teach and study mathematics, respectively. There they connected with many Palestinian and other Arab leftists and the European New Left. 2 days before the June 1967 war erupted, facilitated by the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, Matzpen and the Palestinian Democratic Front, a clandestine group of Palestinians operating in Jordan with representatives in Europe, issued a joint statement which the Times of London published on June 8th. It's unclear who the Palestinian Democratic Front were. Likely they were influenced by Trotskyist ideas similar to those that Nicola introduced to Matzpen. The preface to the text explains that the 2 groups, quote, decided to publish this statement openly at this time so that the bridges of understanding between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East will not be irreparably damaged by the present crisis, unquote. Shortly after the June 1967 war, Matzpen and the Palestinian Democratic Front issued a second statement calling for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied Arab territories. Quote, taking into account the international significance of the June 1967 war, out of principled opposition to the Zionist policy of establishing facts and forcing them on the Arabs, out of concern for the future of Israel within the Arab world, we believe that it is our duty to call on the Israeli government to withdraw from the occupied territories and from the attempt to impose order by force. This call is the test for every progressive body and person. The second statement reiterated the 2 groups' analysis of June 3rd, and since I already quoted from that, I will not do it again at length, but just hit a few highlights. Essentially, the Israeli-Arab problem is not limited to the question of refugees or borders or the question of the political future of the Arabs of Palestine.
All of these are just different aspects and manifestations of the central problem, the future of Israel in the heart of a region that is distinctly Arab. The question is whether Israel will become a second edition of the Crusader states, or will it succeed in integrating into the space and historical processes that will determine its fate. From this perspective, the war did not advance Israel even a tiny bit towards the solution of this fundamental problem. Quite the opposite. Despite the current military balance of power, Israel remains a small island in the Arab world. Notwithstanding the military-political earthquake of the 1967 war, in opposition to the triumphalist militarism that prevailed in most sectors of Israeli Jewish society, Matzpen upheld the political analysis that it had developed before the war. The headline of the August 1967 edition of Matzpen's journal declared, "An old story, rebellion and resistance against a foreign occupation." On September 22nd, 1967, several Matzpen members, not identified as such, co-signed with others, 12 of them in all, a paid ad in Haaretz demanding immediate evacuation of the occupied territories and proclaiming, "Keeping the occupied territories will turn us into a nation of murderers and murdered." While most Israelis debated whether the territories conquered during the war were held or administered or liberated, Matzpen raised the slogan, "Down with the occupation, Hala HaKibush." Matzpen's forthright opposition to the Jewish-Israeli consensus drew a small number of young people who were unwilling to be colonial occupiers into its circles, especially university students and others influenced by the politics and culture of the global New Left. Michel Warshawski, Mikado, the son of the chief rabbi of Strasbourg, arrived in Jerusalem in 1965 to study Talmud. His parents had resisted the Nazi occupation of France, and he had supported the cause of Algerian independence as a teenager. That legacy enabled him to understand intuitively on his first visit to occupied Hebron, with no broader political analysis, the meaning of occupation and to refuse it. He recalled in his memoir, quote, "I saw the submissive and humiliated look of the Arab merchant. I suddenly became aware that he was oppressed, and I was on the other side, with the strong, with the ones in power. I immediately and spontaneously refused to be on that side. I continued to believe that the Arabs were responsible for the war and that the Israelis were within their rights, but I was unwilling to make the jump from that to being an occupier. I felt a natural compassion for the occupied." Mikado soon became a leading member of the Trotskyist current in Matzpen. While Matzpen upheld the unconditional right of the conquered to resist occupation, it supported only such organizations which also recognized the right of the Israeli people for self-determination. It envisioned a joint struggle of Arabs and Jews in the region for a common future. Therefore, it looked to, but was mostly disappointed by, the post-1967 Palestinian and broader Arab political arena. Before the 1967 war, Matzpen had criticized the PLO and its chairman, Ahmed Shukeri. After the war, it criticized what Israelis believed was Shukeri's call to throw the Jews into the sea. In fact, Shukeri never said those exact words, but he did express eliminationist ideas about Israeli Jews. At an Amman press conference on June 2nd, he declared, "We shall destroy Israel together with its inhabitants, and for those who remain, if any do, the boats will be waiting to banish them." Or according to another version, "Whoever survives will stay in Philistine, but in my opinion, no one will remain alive." Shukeri tried but failed to clear his name and resigned as chairman of the PLO in December 1967. Matzpen was similarly critical of Fatah. Shortly after the war, Oded Plavsky, one of the three founding leaders, wrote, "Do we support the actions of Fatah? No. We oppose its actions on a principled basis. Why? Because for us, the goals, both political and military, are determinate. The goal of Fatah is not to abolish the occupation of one people by another, but only to reverse the situation, to make the Arabs the occupiers and the Jews the occupied. Our support is given in advance to any political movement in the occupied territories which accepts the principle of both peoples' right to national self-determination. An ISO position paper written by Machover and Nicola argued that the formula of a secular democratic state for Muslims, Christians, and Jews, first proposed by the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and adopted by the Palestine National Council in 1969, did not address the existence of an Israeli Jewish national entity distinct from both Palestinian Arabs and other Jews. That slogan, they wrote, was a misapprehension of, quote, the national problem in general and of Israeli reality in particular. It is true that Jews living in Israel came to settle here under the influence and leadership of Zionism, and that they, as a community, have oppressed and are still oppressing Palestinians. But it is impossible to ignore the patent fact that today this community constitutes a national entity, unquote. The only hope for Israeli Jews to be won away from Zionism was for the Arab Revolution to recognize their right to self-determination. Matzpen was also critical of Fatah and the PLO for adopting a strategy that neglected the necessity of a broader Arab revolution to achieve even the limited goal of Palestinian liberation. As they distanced themselves from Fatah, Matzpen attempted to find a new partner in the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was established in 1969 following a split in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Like Matzpen, the DFLP rejected a narrow focus on local Palestinian nationalism, initially at least. The organization's leader, Naif Hawatmeh, directed Khalil al-Hindi, a DFLP member and a student in London, to contact Moshe Machover to initiate an exchange of views. In an interview with the DFLP organ Al-Hurriya, Hawatmeh reported on this contact and announced that the DFLP would soon be conducting a dialogue with Matzpen in Europe. Uri Avneri's iconoclastic weekly, Ha'olam Hazeh, This World, reported this to the Israeli Hebrew reading public. Matzpen hailed this connection and printed a Hebrew translation of Hawatmeh's manifesto entitled For a Democratic Solution to the Palestinian Problem and the Israeli Problem. Most Matzpen members were not prepared to accept Hawatmeh's invitation that they join the Palestinian armed struggle. The question of how closely to align with the DFLP was a factor in two groups leaving Matzpen. The Maoist Third Worldist Revolutionary Communist Alliance, Habrit HaKomunisti Tamapchanit, advocated closer alignment with the Palestinian struggle. The Lambertist Trotskyist Workers' Alliance, Brit HaPoalim, sought closer alignment with the Israeli working class. In April 11th, 1974, likely in an attempt to thwart the PLO from adopting an early version of the two-state solution, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command escalated the armed struggle with an assault on the northern Israeli town of Kiryat Shmona. Its fighters killed 18 people, including 8 children and 2 soldiers, and wounded 16 others. Although the DFLP politically opposed the Popular Front General Command, it apparently felt the need to demonstrate that it was no less militant. On May 15th, 1974, 3 DFLP fighters seized a school building in the Galilee town of Ma'alot. They took 115 hostages, mostly school children, and threatened to kill them if Israel did not release 26 Palestinian prisoners. The Knesset agreed to negotiate, but the message did not reach the DFLP fighters. Just before the expiration of the deadline, the IDF attacked and killed all the DFLP fighters, who in turn killed 25 of the hostages and 6 other civilians and wounded 68 during the shootout. In the 2 months before the Ma'alot attack, Naif Hawatmeh published several articles, including one in the widely read Hebrew daily Yediot Achronot, promoting a two-state solution, recognizing the existence of an Israeli nation, and advocating dialogue with progressive Israelis. The DFLP had been promoting these ideas since before the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. They were implied by the PLO's June 1974 transitional program. The large number of deaths of children at Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot aroused outrage in Israel, some of it directed at the IDF, which had not performed well in both incidents. All the factions of Matzpen denounced these attacks on towns well within Israel's pre-June 1967 borders. The DFLP's inability to exercise discipline and discrimination in conducting armed struggle destroyed its credibility for Matzpen. Following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Said Hamami, the PLO's representative in London, invited Moshe Machover to meet in his flat several times, and eventually he agreed to record their conversation. In December 1975, they held a joint press conference to publicize their exchange. With Hamami's agreement, Matzpen published a Hebrew transcript. Hamami told Machover, "Not a single progressive Palestinian can say to an Israeli Jew, 'You don't have a right to this country.' But not a single Israeli Jew can say to a Palestinian Arab, 'I have more right to this country than you.' We probably have a bit more right to Palestine than the Israeli Jews. But the fact is that we both exist as peoples. The question is the conflict the only relationship possible between these two peoples? My reply is definitely not. The Palestinian Arabs and the Israeli Jews both believe they belong to the same land, so the simple answer is that they both live in it," unquote. Hamami proposed that as a first step, the country be partitioned into two states, but that this would not be the final resolution of the question. Machover asked Hamami about Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot, and Hamami replied, quote, "I cannot accept terrorism, not only for moral, but also for political reasons, because I am a progressive Palestinian, and I believe that if you kill Israelis indiscriminately, you are playing into the hands of the Zionist establishment. Our enemy is Zionism, not all Israelis," unquote. In 1972, Matzpen suffered a major split in which those who came to oppose the two-state solution affiliated with the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. Machover engaged with Hamami on behalf of the other faction, which, since it included the founding leaders, could credibly claim to be the continuation of the original Matzpen. By the time a version of what Hamami proposed was unequivocally adopted by the PLO in 1988, he was 10 years dead, assassinated most likely by the agents of Abu Nidal. In their classic 1971 New Left review, this is the conclusion here, so hold on to your seats. In their classic 1971 New Left Review article, The Class Nature of Israeli Society, Chaim Hanegbi, Moshe Machover, and Akiva Orr explained, Israeli society is not merely a society of immigrants, it is one of settlers. This society, including its working class, was shaped through a process of colonization. This process, which has been going on for 80 years, was not carried out in a vacuum, but in a country populated by another people. The permanent conflict between the settler society and the indigenous, displaced Palestinian Arabs, has never stopped, and it has shaped the very structure of Israeli society, politics, and economics, unquote. Therefore, although there was an Israeli Jewish working class, it could not, under the current conditions, become a revolutionary subject, and organizing Israeli workers was secondary to the general strategy of the struggle against Zionism. In the introduction to the Hebrew volume, The Independent Left in Israel, 1967 to 1993, a collection in memory of Noam Kamener, Matan Kamener, Noam's son, and I argued that the core element of Matzpen's analysis of post-1967 Israel, its settler colonial character, is correct. However, in the post-1967 period, the various currents of the independent left, as well as the non-Zionist Rakach, the mainly Arab faction of the Communist Party, rejected Matzpen's analysis because it was not a viable basis for political organizing against the post-1967 occupation or in support of the Israeli Black Panthers and the Mizrahi struggle more broadly, or any other issue in Israel. It was impossible then, as now, to organize any significant number of Israeli Jews on an explicitly anti-Zionist platform. Many, perhaps most, Palestinians of Israel are open to recognizing the right of Israeli Jews to self-determination, albeit not in the form of a Jewish state as it currently exists. For Palestinians living under occupation or in the diaspora, especially following the failure of the Oslo process, this has become highly contested, all the more so following a genocide. An essential tenet of Fatah and the other organizations that led the post-1967 Palestinian national movement was their refusal to depend on a broader Arab revolution to secure Palestinian liberation. Therefore, Matzpen's analysis of Israeli society was and remains correct in its essentials, but it also was and remains unviable as a basis for political organizing and mobilization in Israel. Thank you.
So as I mentioned, Esmat Elhalaby is unable to travel. He is sick, as you will hear and see in his recorded video. So I'm going to let this play. Jan already introduced Esmat, and when this is finished, we'll open up conversation for Q&A. Only Joel will be responding. Jan may respond. Esmat's not going to call in or anything, I don't think. So.
Hello, everyone. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be in Princeton with you all in person today, that I couldn't join you in the great United States of America. That being said, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and to build on this important work. The title of my paper is Zionism's Third World, and it is equal parts about Zionism and anti-Zionism. I think Palestinians have a pretty clear idea of what Zionism means. Zionism is synonymous with dispossession, with expulsion, incarceration, exclusion, and discrimination. Zionism is the demolition of your house, the death of your family, the murder of your father, the rape of your uncle, the decapitation of your sister. For the Palestinian, Zionism is undeniably violence. But Zionism's violence has not been confined to the land of Palestine. We might begin today with the definition of Zionism offered by Abdelaziz Shaheen, the Fathawi militant, who spent more than 15 years in Israeli prison, 12 of those in solitary confinement. This incarceration offered him significant time to consider the contours of Zionism as it was imprinted upon his body. As he writes in his prison memoirs, "Whoever has not suffered at the hands of the Zionists does not know what the Zionist movement is. For me, Zionism is not merely a racist or fascist movement. Zionism is a state of torture. It is a state of torture for all people in the world and for all humanity. Whoever reviews the history of the Zionist movement will find it to be a constant state of torture for countries, regimes, parties, peoples, and the places where it exists. Wherever it exists, it is a state of torture. What is the Zionist lobby? The Zionist lobby is a state of torture for the existing policy in the country itself." This definition, Abdelaziz concludes, reached me through practice and bitter experience recorded upon my own flesh. I hesitate to offer this definition, lest I be accused of anti-Semitism, given the way anti-Semitism has been abused, especially against people with a condition as severe as mine, that is, being Palestinian. According to the Israeli occupation, everything in Gaza, our history books, our atlases, even the very word Palestine, is anti-Semitic, Moin Ipseso once wrote. But I offer the insight of Abdelaziz that Abdelaziz gleaned from the violence he experienced anyways, because I don't think it's hyperbolic to understand Zionism's role in world affairs as torturous. The ways that Zionism inflicts regularly repeated violence on the Palestinian body politic with complete impunity is torture on a world scale, exposing daily for citizens of states the world over the lengths their governments will go to do nothing. Which isn't to say it's unique or alone. We live in a world rife with insidious ideologies, all of which deserve our thoroughgoing, honest critique. Moreover, we don't need to turn to the third world to arrive at this conclusion. We can simply see the subordination of the American university's interests to the interests of the Israeli war machine, the repression of American students not for the criticism of the American state, but for their condemnations of Israel and Zionism, for their courageous, if meager, efforts to stop a genocide. But I do want to turn to the third world in this paper, and not merely Israel's international relations. Its official links with the reactionary regimes is well known, from apartheid South Africa to Guatemala. My interest, rather, is in those locations of Israeli society that are often brandished as sources for Israel and Zionism's redemption, as the decent humanist core of a rotten apple, the Zionist left and Israeli academia. Official Israeli policy, if I can mention it, towards the third world, at least in those decades when the leaders of decolonizing countries still held out to some hope for genuine change in the world, was hostility. As Yitzhak Harari, a member of the Knesset and of the Israeli delegation to the UN General Assembly in 1955, put it, the most significant development in Israel's favor was the 1955 defeat of the Bandung Conference countries on practically every issue brought before the General Assembly. That was a quote. This is a key admission, for despite Israeli efforts to represent themselves as friends or brothers of Afro-Asia, Israeli national interests, inasmuch as they were deeply linked to the imperial interests of the North Atlantic, shared little at the material level with those of their neighbors. I mention this because there's considerable interest in this international history now by those enamored by a historiographical tendency toward the global or the imperial. Their efforts, they claim, is to rescue the historical study of Zionism and Israel from the silo of Palestine. What this work does, in fact, is obfuscate Zionist violence and Israel's imperial attachments, but that is a story for another time. My interest here is to demonstrate the depth of the racism, condescension, and denial in Zionism's ideological engagements with the erstwhile Third World. This was a racism that imbued every aspect of Zionism's forms of knowledge. These encounters, to use a neutral idiom, were often mediated through Zionism's first and greatest victims, the Palestinians. Take, for example, the occasion of a 1956 lecture by Moshe Sharit at the Indian Council of World Affairs in Delhi, Sapru House, narrated by Sharit himself in his well-known and revealing diaries. A very young Arab, Sharit recounts of the Q&A, jumped to his feet to counter my remarks to the effect that there was no irregular military forces in Israel, and threw the Dir Yassin and Kibbutz incidents in my face with a kind of hatred of which only an Arab is capable. That an Arab might confront Sharit over the premeditated massacre of many dozens of Palestinians, to use conservative counts, and the destruction of villages in 1948 and 1953, mere years before the meeting itself, is considered beyond the pale. The young Arab is throwing these incidents in his face, embodying a hatred, apparently, of unique Arab vintage. The rhetoric of Sharit's Indian sojourn is merely one testament to the arrogance with which Zionism traveled across the vast Third World. To put it in the most boring possible way, I'm a historian of meetings. Conferences have been relatively understudied by scholars despite the outsized role they've played in the professional life of academics. As Nicolas Guillot has written, All academics have participated in gatherings where budget constraints, political decisions, promotion opportunities, off-the-cuff ideas, and institutional strategies are coated with the gloss of intellectual necessity and scientific progress. Yet academics write disciplinary history as if such meetings never take place or have any epistemic effect. It's a quote. Conferences were a fundamental part of 20th century political, intellectual, and economic life. The Party Congress and the University Seminar were regular fixtures of collaboration and knowledge creation. From the Congress of Toilers of the Far East to Bretton Woods, meetings were the literal stages upon which new types of relationships could be enacted. They are, at bottom, sites of confrontation. The Anti-Zionist Idea, this conference, is a confrontation by design. Now, before I turn back to Zionism and our present confrontation, I want to take a moment to map for you the Third World on its own terms, which were not in any way monolithic. My reasons for this are to make clear that while Zionism may have some unique historical characteristics on the temporal and ideological plane, it's not necessarily exceptional. In theory and practice, Edward Said once wrote, Zionism is a degraded repetition of European imperialism, unquote. Decades of study in comparative settler colonialism testifies to this. I do this also to emphasize that our anti-Zionism now is but a part of a larger constellation of popular struggles for national liberation, towards decolonization, and against racism. Anti-Zionism is not a mere Palestinian project. The anti-Zionist idea is international in its heritage and transnational in its articulation. Let us travel now the circuit between Accra, New Delhi, and Algiers for a few moments. From December 11th to the 18th, 1962, hundreds of scholars converged on the University of Ghana for the first International Congress of Africanists. Scarcely a year later, on January 4th, 1964, the 26th International Congress of Orientalists convened in New Delhi, the first time that scholarly body, initiated in Paris in 1873, met in Asia. For the Africanists assembled, the prospect of doing African studies in Africa was paramount. It's therefore proper and fitting, Kwame Nkrumah would announce at the opening of the Accra meeting, that a Congress of Africanists should take place in Africa. Nkrumah's address was a blistering critique of colonial knowledge, and he demanded that new knowledge of Africa serve African political projects for the progress of the African. While some of us are engaged with the political unification of Africa, Africanists everywhere must also help in building the spiritual and cultural foundations for the unity of our continent, Nkrumah concluded. In New Delhi, the spirit of the Congress was somewhat different. Humayun Kabir, a prominent Indian intellectual and bureaucrat, presided over the events. Unlike Nkrumah, who offered a succinct history of Africanist participation in the immiseration of Africans, Kabir's opening speech bordered on the sycophantic. The fact that the Congress has never before met outside of the European continent is a tribute to the many savants and scholars of Europe who have pursued, with single-minded devotion, their studies in various aspects of the life of non-European peoples, Kabir said. It must be noted, however, that Kabir's claim that this was the first meeting of the Orientalists outside the European continent is not true. The 14th Congress, held in Algiers in 1905, was the first outside of Europe. That Congress was an opportunity to showcase the jewel of France's Oriental Empire to Europe's scholar combatants. In a sense, the 1905 meeting belonged to a wholly different era, when European imperialism was still waxing steadily across the globe. But attention to the event reveals how the debate over colonial knowledge, which raged at the acme of the anti-colonial struggle, was intimately related to that struggle's very beginnings. In his report on the Congress, the French Orientalist Edouard Montet praised the French colonial government in Algeria for their role in organizing the meeting. Nevertheless, Montet was keen to make clear that the Orientalists should not meet in such an Oriental African place again. I do not think that after the experience obtained at Algiers, it would be proposed to assemble in a hurry another Congress of Orientalists in the Muslim Orient, he wrote. The reasons for this, according to Montet, quote, is the notable participation in it of the Muslim element and the attitude taken by the believers in Islam. Montet goes on to recount 3 incidents, one of them a dispute between the German Orientalist Karl Wohlers and the Egyptian radical intellectual Abdelaziz Jaweish, centered on the Quran and its interpretation. Purportedly, Jaweish, the eloquent and impassioned interpreter, responded to Wohlers' presentation by claiming for Muslims only, the sole study of the sacred book. This incident, Montet concludes, quote, shows the unfathomable abyss, not too strong a word to use, which separates the Muslim from the European mind, unquote. One needs to look no further than Jaweish's own work for greater elaboration. The incident became an infamous, indeed key part of Jaweish's biography. An heir to the intellectual tradition of Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Jaweish was an Egyptian nationalist writer and adept anti-imperialist strategist. In addition to his schooling in Egypt, Jaweish was immersed in English Orientalism, having studied pedagogy in London and taught Arabic at Oxford and Cambridge. His intervention in Algiers was published in Cairo the same year as Al-Islam Din al-Fitra, Islam, Religion of Instinct, by his comrade, the journalist Ahmed Hilmi. In his introduction to Jaweish's text, Hilmi noted that anyone who, quote, tasted the eloquence and power of its argument, unquote, was astonished, hence the need to reprint it. Jaweish's text served as a testament to his countrymen and to anti-imperial pan-Islamists worldwide that the confrontation with Europe and the defense of Islam against Orientalism was as much a struggle on the ground as it was in the mind. If Egypt had indeed been colonized by representation, the historian Hussein Omar wrote in his reading of Jaweish's treatise, then its decolonization had to undo the relationship between the words and things upon which its colonization was premised. Jaweish, therefore, was not engaging in a facile apologetic, but rather asserting that Muslims held the universal capacities for self-rule that his colonial oppressors persistently denied him. It's difficult to say that Kabir was ignorant of Algiers. It is, after all, listed in the proceedings of the Delhi Conference and those of previous congresses of Orientalists. More tellingly, however, Algiers' disappearance speaks to what is being proffered in Kabir's account. Kabir may very well not have known what transpired at Algiers, what it represented to the French Empire and to a group of Egyptian radicals, but it is precisely the narrative that Kabir relates of rapprochement between Orientalists and Orientals, and of a hidden history of Oriental suzerainty vis-a-vis Orientalist knowledge that is significant. Kabir's, in the end, is a story of cooperation rather than confrontation. But despite Kabir's wishes, a confrontation was had. Israelis, infamously excluded from Bandung in 1955, were present in large numbers at the Accra and Delhi Congresses of 63-64. Their reports on the events are revealing. A month after the Congress, at a meeting of the Israeli Oriental Society in Jerusalem, Uriel Hod, an Israeli diplomat turned Ottomanist from the Hebrew University, presented his reflections. Published later in the Society's journal, HaMizrach HaChadesh, or the New East, Hod's remarks are revealing of the persistence of colonial condescension. Convening a Congress of Orientalists in an Eastern country has merits, Hod remarked, such as the opportunity to see an Eastern country up close. However, one should not ignore the great shortcomings arising from this either. In India, there was quite a large number of amateurs among the Indian lecturers, people with a good traditional education, but pre-scientific, whose lectures sometimes had an apologetic tone. Unquote. While some Indian Pan-Asianists had abandoned the confrontation with Orientalism, Orientalism itself, its energies renewed by the conquest of Palestine, had not moved from the position it pronounced in 1905 at the meeting in Algiers. Holt expands upon his point. Quote, "We have largely adapted to Western research methods. In relation to many people from Asian and African countries, we are freer from an excessive emotional attachment to the subjects of our research." Unquote. Other participants in the meeting emphasized that their contributions were considered the best and complained about their exclusion from the organization of the Congress and the lamentable inclusion of Arabs in the Orientalist Secretariat. In his report for HaMizrach HaChadesh on the Accra Congress, Pitzak Shenar expanded at length on the presence of Arabs and Muslim Africans at the conference and complained too about what he saw as their defensive positions. None of this rhetoric will be unfamiliar to those who've immersed themselves in the European imperialism's libraries. What is ironic about this posturing is the extent to which it imbued every aspect of Zionism's career in the Third World. When, a few years later in 1966, Israeli groups were not invited to the first Tricontinental Congress in Havana, and the assembled delegates produced a resolution condemning Israel and supporting Palestinian liberation, the Israeli Peace Committee, a group representing Israel's communist parties, issued a dramatic memorandum. The failure to invite any section at all from Israel, the Israeli statement read, was a surrender to the pressure of Arab chauvinism, which has been abusing justified international support for the aspiration of the Arab peoples for liberation and has been imposing its hostile attitude toward Israel on international gatherings, the statement read. Repeatedly in the memo, Israel's left lamented their exclusion. Quote, "Hard on the heels of Israel's exclusion came the adoption of an anti-Israel resolution in the spirit of extremist Arab chauvinism." The memo continues. The Havana Conference's resolutions defining the essence of the Zionist movement as imperialistic and describing the movement's structure and methods as racist and fascist are false from the very outset. They distort the movement's path, gravely offend the feelings of the people of Israel, and abet the stirring up of hatred against the Jews. Unquote. Israel and Zionism are completely naturalized in the statement. Reference to occupation, recall this is 1966, is rendered completely illegitimate and unacceptable. Justifications for the Palestinian struggle for national liberation are labeled merely and repeatedly as Arab chauvinism. Arab delegates, and there were a number, including 5 Palestinian delegates representing the PLO, the lawyer Salah ad-Din al-Dabbagh, the great poet Abdul Karim al-Karmi, aka Abu Salma, the trade unionist Hosni al-Qfesh, the journalist and editor Zuhair al-Rais, and the statesman Ibrahim Abu Sitta, one of the founders of the PLO, are all transfigured into warmongers and mischief makers, Israel's left, beleaguered, and honest peacemakers. What is interesting about the Tricontinental's resolution, however, the one that angered the Israeli left so much, is its explicit international orientation, and its recognition of Zionism's traffic in aid and expertise across the Third World. This is how the resolution reads. The conference warns against what is called Israeli technical and financial aid and considers it a new disguised method of U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism. The conference requests all progressive parties and committees to multiply their efforts to combat Zionist infiltration and penetration in their countries and to abrogate the various agreements concluded with Israel. So while the conference itself attunes itself to the reality of actually existing imperialism and colonialism, Israel's peaceniks remain attached to the mythological visions of settler nationhood. Quote, "The boycotting of the representatives of Israel was therefore the boycotting of a people like any of the peoples of Asia," their memorandum read. What's striking about this incantation is its resemblance to a statement made almost 20 years earlier, on the very eve of Palestine's dismemberment, at a meeting which helped inaugurate the forms of Southern affiliation, which Havana's gathering was the latest. At that 1947 Asian Relations Conference in Delhi, there was a large and prominent delegation from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Palestine delegation, as it was called. Its head, the librarian and philosopher Hugo Bergman, introduced the delegation in these terms. Quote, "These are the greetings of the representatives of an old religion and an old Asian people, which was driven from its Asian motherland 1800 years ago," unquote. Bergman's remarks were met with immediate response by Karima Saeed of the Egyptian Feminist Union. "I would like to place before you the views of the Arab women," Saeed began her retort. "We strongly object to any settlement in Palestine except for the Arabs. We have no trouble with the Jews at all. They have been welcome. They have been our friends. They have settled very happily among us. But we do not want British rule to be replaced by that of European Zionists. We object to them as foreigners. The Arabs must live in Palestine." Unquote. While Zionism laid claim on one corner of Asia, others were keen to disavow the settler nation. In an essay from around 1971 on Asia and Palestine, printed as both a pamphlet by the Arab League's New Delhi office and in Ibrahim Abulugh's influential volume, The Transformation of Palestine, the Indian political scientist and reigning expert on West Asian affairs in Delhi, Muhammad Shafi Agwani, traced Asian diplomatic relations with Israel and Palestine and explained the political and philosophical reasons why Asians have opposed Israeli colonialism and supported Palestinian anti-colonialism. Agwani rebuts declarations that Asian opposition to Israel is the product of their ignorance of Jewish history, as some had asserted. "Asia," he wrote, "has viewed the Zionist claim with suspicion and disapprobation. An explanation for this must be sought in the incompatibility between the anti-colonial upsurge in Asia and the methods and goals of the Zionist movement," unquote. Agwani rehearses the details of British imperial support for the Zionist project in Palestine before describing the entanglements of Indian anti-colonialism with the Arabs and Afro-Asian opposition to Israel at the United Nations. Agwani concludes, quote, that the Zionist belief in the uniqueness of the Jewish race and its historic mission, the ideological amalgam of race, religion, and politics, and above all, the Israeli model of a garrison state have little practical relevance to the pressing needs of the Asian nations for development and peace, unquote. The idioms of non-alignment, development, and peace are summoned against the racism and militarism of an Israel still serving imperial power. The Asian perspective, as it were, is one which pulls Israel into the context of Asian history in order to declare it alien to Asian space and time. The irony, of course, is that this is in a sense the mirror opposite of the reigning American view of ubiquitous defensiveness with regard to Israeli actions, coupled with a mythology of historical and geographical justification. The circumvention of the Third World's United Nations decolonizing agenda in the 1960s through alternative mechanisms of international governance controlled by American capital, namely the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the United States' militarization of the world, meant that no Asian power was equipped to confront Israel effectively on the diplomatic score or in the battlefield. But that confrontation can still happen here. In the academic halls we assemble in, the streets we assemble in, the once and future encampments, the prisons, and well beyond, the Zionist idea has been extinguished from the popular imagination. That particular battle, for what it's worth, has been won irrevocably for a generation at least. Having exhausted its energies in the shadow world of sovereign myths, Zionism, the idea, has been left scrambling. Afro-Asian feeling having waned, Stand With Us now makes TikToks about something called Israeli indigenous resistance. Indeed, farce does not begin to capture the mendacity and denial which characterizes Zionist thought at every level, in diplomatic fora, in state legislatures, in the press, among official spokespeople, unofficial spokespeople, official, unofficial spokespeople, that army of campus-based fellows some of you will be familiar with. So all that is left now is force, the endless, merciless murder of Palestinians in Gaza, and of course, the repression, intimidation, and criminalization of anti-Zionism that has become completely normalized and even championed here in North America. If the Zionist idea is dead or dying, the anti-Zionist idea, which encompasses the world, has never been so alive. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now have a Q&A. Just remind you of the protocols that Max recited right in the beginning. And if someone violates it, I'll ask you to repeat it to test your understanding and memory. So let's start. Question?
Thank you so much, Professor Beinin, for your presentation. As someone who focuses more on the contemporary environment, I'm curious to understand how much of the history of Zionism, and anti-Zionism and non-Zionism, and all the different types of Zionisms are taught to the Jewish American communities. It's very diverse. And because what I have at least observed, I will say, is that very few people who are interested and quite zealous about defending Zionism and equating it with Judaism, whether they actually understand or have been taught the complex history of Zionism and the anti-Zionist movements that you touched on. So could you enlighten us about, where is this situated within broader, diverse Jewish American communities, especially those who are really upset right now about anti-Semitism and I think misdefining it?
Okay, so we're shifting gears here because I'm a historian of the Middle East and not of North American Jewry. I am a historian, so let's historicize. Before 1967, most American Jews were not active Zionists. Only a minority were actively anti-Zionist. Most were indifferent, and they supported Israel as a philanthropic activity, not as a political commitment, and they certainly didn't imagine immigrating to Israel or anything like that, except for a few weirdos like myself. So that changed after the 1967 war, which Norman Punharitz, then editor of Commentary when it was still a progressive magazine, soon to become a neocon organ, he spoke about the war as the Zionization of American Jewry. And what has happened since 1967 is very well portrayed in the film Israelism, which if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it to you, in which you see there people like Simone Zimmerman, who's the heroine of the film, but there are several other voices as well, saying, I never heard the word occupation in 12 years of Jewish day school. And that has become the norm in most sectors of the organized North American Jewish community. There are, however, exceptions. So the Reconstructionist denomination of the Jewish community, which is the smallest and the most left-leaning, officially embraces the two-state solution, opposes the Israeli occupation, supports the right of Palestinian people to self-determination in an independent state. But about half of the recent graduating classes of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College are anti-Zionists, openly anti-Zionist. And if you go back, I don't know, maybe 8 months ago, there was a big scandal because there was an article about this published in The Forward, which is the foremost American Jewish newspaper, about all the anti-Zionist rabbinical students at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. So within the Reconstructionist movement, there's a debate. Then, especially since October 7th, and in light of the ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip, but also before that, there has been a flourishing of independent, non-Zionist or anti-Zionist minyanim, how do we translate that, prayer groups, all around the country. There's also been sharpening of conversation within many congregations. So, for example, I belong to a Reconstructionist congregation in Portland, Oregon. Very, very new thing for me. I couldn't walk into most synagogues on the San Francisco Peninsula when I was teaching at Stanford. It's a congregation whose previous rabbi, already going back 35 years, had a long history of opposing the occupation, supporting two states, so on. I joined at the very end of 2018, early 2019, and since I joined, I've taught classes very similar to the ones I taught at Stanford for so many years about Israel, Palestine, and so on. And I'd say that there are now about 525 families in the congregation. It's the third largest one in the state of Oregon. Maybe 20% of the members. So first, a good chunk of the members don't think about this question at all. They want to get their kids bar mitzvahed, bat mitzvahed, whatever. They eat lox and bagels. They don't care about Israel, Palestine. But 20% or so are not Zionists. The synagogue supported a ceasefire, too late, in my opinion, and not strongly enough, but it did. Our rabbi belongs to Rabbis for Ceasefire, but the steering committee of the synagogue did not want to disaffiliate itself from the Jewish Federation's war rally on November 10th, I think it was, 2023, or from the Jewish Federation's sponsorship of a day of commemoration on October 7th, 2024. Even though there are strong elements in the congregation, among them me, who said, no, don't do that. So the problem is this. Since the Zionization of North American Jewry, American Jewish identity has been focused on two pegs: Holocaust commemoration and support for Israel. And if you take away support for Israel, what's left?
So Ariel Angel, the editor of Jewish Currents, speaking to that problem, says, oh, and therefore we re-embrace our religious identity, which is weird for secularists of my generation, but I'm doing it with them because I want to be with them. So there is an ongoing struggle. Struggle isn't the right word because sometimes it has to be very subtle, but there's a process in which, for sure, most younger Jews who care to continue to identify themselves as Jews, I mean, that's kind of important there, are not having it. Their parents grit their teeth and notice that their children and grandchildren are not having it, and mostly they can't tear themselves away from their Israelism, which is a very big element of the substance of their Judaism. But again, if I can point to my own congregation, because I'm not a big scholar of North American Jewry, I'm the wrong person really to answer this question. So we have had now for the last half year a monthly Palestine Solidarity Kabbalat Shabbat, welcoming of the Sabbath on Friday night. 50-ish people come. The rabbi fully supports it. It's about to become a recognized element of the ritual committee's agenda with a budget. And it is led by a group of under 30-somethings, an affinity group who call themselves queer anti-Zionist Jews. I am not a queer anti-Zionist Jew, but they invite me to come and speak at Friday night services. And so we have a kind of coalition, generational, political, in the synagogue. So this is not, in some synagogues, there is no space whatsoever for this sort of thing. And in others, space is being created as we speak. Okay, this is a very Jewish conversation that you've asked me to talk about. I feel almost embarrassed, especially because Esmat isn't even here and can't speak to the question. I mean, we know that there's a structural problem of the disproportionate Jewish voice in the whole discussion here, so I apologize for having added to that.
I think because we're close to time, we might just take a few questions together, and then, so I think Alejandro.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those were two very valuable talks. Joel, I wanted to ask you, I'm over here, about, so it seems to me that today, Jewish and Israeli anti-Zionism, as it becomes anti-colonial and not just kind of this older anti-Zionism of, let's say, European Jewish leaders at the beginning of the 20th century who saw Zionism as trying to, quote, force God's hand or something like that, or those who rejected Zionism out of fear that it would mean they would have to leave their homes. So an actual anti-colonial anti-Zionism is often or almost always linked to Palestinian anti-colonialism and anti-Zionism. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on that. I mean, I don't know if you agree or not, but with respect to Matzpen and how, because it did seem to take a very anti-colonial perspective, as you described in your talk, and whether that relationship to Palestinian anti-colonialism comes from an earlier era, perhaps Mandate Palestine Communist Party or the like. Thanks.
If I might, I'm going to just toss in one question before we go up there. Joel, I wanted to invite you. I'm over here. Hi. Look to your right if you want to see me. I wanted to ask you just to comment on the very interesting and potentially generative place where your and Esmat's talks intersected, specifically about your main argument about the centrality of Israeli Jewish nationhood, and even more important, recognition of it by Palestinians and also in the international arena, because he's telling a story that's basically an inversion of that, which is a conscious and even principled rejection of that recognition. So I thought you might be able to comment on that a little bit.
Thanks. Well, it would be good to thank Esmat as well, but thank you, Joel. I have a question. Could you tell us a bit about what happened to Matzpen members later in this history and until today? I'm thinking specifically about people, say, like Dan Diner, right, who, you know, seem to have traveled the path to, you know, a kind of Jewish supremacist position, right, from their Matzpen days. So how does that happen? You know, what happened to a lot of Matzpen members after those days that you were recounting?
These are all very different. So first, yes, Matzpen, let's say not from 1962 when it was founded, but from 1964 when it clearly began to understand Zionism as a form of settler colonialism. And the only example of settler colonialism in its original formulation, incorrectly. Matzpen clearly aligned itself with the rising forces of anti-colonialism in what was then called the Third World. Today we would say the Global South. And it did not believe in that it was possible to resolve the Palestine question within the borders from the river to the sea. There was going to have to be a regional Arab anti-imperialist socialist revolution, and that was the context in which there might be some form of recognition of Israeli Jewish national identity and so forth. They just simply didn't think it was viable that Palestine could be liberated within the borders of the British Mandate. So that's a Trotskyist notion, with all the problems of Trotskyism, which relates to how Dan Diner got to where he got to. I'll speak to that in a minute. Which, of course, the Palestine Communist Party rejected. I mean, Stalinism, theoretically, aside from its various and many crimes, was about socialism in one country. So if you could have socialism in the Soviet Union, you could also have socialism in Palestine. So that's a clear divide. So the Palestine Communist Party became, by the time of the Arab Revolution of 1936-39, clearly anti-Zionist, clearly saw Zionism as an ally of British imperialism. That position it had reached at its formation in 1923. But the geographical frame was Palestine. And this was the difference between Maki and Matzpen, and then Rakach, the mainly Arab faction of Maki, which today reclaimed the name Communist Party of Israel, and Matzpen. What happened? So, what happened to people in Matzpen? So first of all, there were always a lot of intellectual hangers-on around Matzpen. I don't know if Danny Diner ever was actually formally a member of Matzpen. He may have been a candidate. I mean, he certainly was in the circle of supporters, but half the time he was in Germany anyway. So, in fact, he never played much of a role
on the Israeli political scene, even to the limited extent that anybody in Matzpen could. But what Danny Diener represents is the slide of people who had their political origins in Trotskyism to neoconservatism. And in the Israeli context, that, of course, entails also Jewish supremacy. Oh, I'm not allowed. Okay. So I'll just finish by saying, why does that happen? Because Trotskyism, despite its globalist anti-colonialism, is in fact a very Eurocentric form of Marxism.
Okay, so I think we. Okay.
From the Latin American Trotskyist movement, we do have an international, pretty big one, like wrote from USEC.
Do you want to ask? Anyone?
If I have more time, I'll speak to the point that Max raised. Okay. Reprieve here. So, it's not fair to have a dialogue with Esmat when he's not here and can't respond. And probably, actually, it would be better if we didn't do it in public anyway, because people don't change their minds about things in public. So my paper isn't a statement of my political position. I never belonged to Matzpen. When I lived in Israel, I belonged to a different political formation, because I saw right away that if you're going to go talk to Jews about anti-Zionism, you have nobody to talk to. I was also very committed, unlike many of the people in my political circle, but unlike Matzpen, to connect to Palestinians. So I took a bunch of students at the Hebrew University to Birzeit University to meet Palestinian students there. I could do that because I spoke Arabic. None of the other Jews did. And all the people around us said, oh, but you don't know, maybe they're terrorists, maybe I'm. No, the occupation has to end. There has to be Jewish-Palestinian joint struggle to end the occupation. We need to find our Palestinian counterparts who want to struggle with us to end the occupation. We were not terribly successful in 1972, but by 10 years later, in the form of the Committee in Solidarity with Birzeit University, which was then under fierce attack by the occupation authorities, much closer and stronger forms of solidarity and joint struggle developed. Today we call that co-resistance. We didn't know that word then. I believed then and have always believed that this has to happen. And once it does happen, and you can see this in the film No Other Land, it's clear that, yeah, of course the Palestinians are going to lead, and of course their notion of how to conduct the struggle and what the struggle consists of is the principal force. And Israeli Jews and internationals of various sorts are secondary elements in that formation, but they're there. And the Palestinians who are doing that know that they're there. How that's going to be politically expressed, if and when we ever win, I don't know. But it will be. It can't disappear as a question. In fact, its salience, if we get to the point of winning, its salience will increase, because at that point there'll be not a very large number, but some more Israeli Jews engaged in that struggle.
Hello, my name is Shirley. I'm wondering, in the discourse of Matzpen or any other Jewish socialist programs of revolutionary politics and anti-Zionism, is there any efforts of drawing from the resources of the Jewish tradition and engaging in some kind of a political theology of Jewish sources and the tradition, or does it remain very avowedly progressive, secular, in the sense of keeping away from that whole theological tradition? Because I would think that to critique ideology of religious nationalism, drawing on resources of the religious tradition might be useful rather than this kind of a progressive, secular minded way of looking at things.
Sure. Okay. Just that one then? Okay. So, yeah, Mikado, the son of the chief rabbi of Strasbourg, came to Israel in 1965 to study Talmud. And of course, he broke with that. I mean, this is somebody I know reasonably well and never had a conversation about religion with him ever, but actually, conceptually, it's an easy transition from becoming a Talmudic scholar to becoming a Trotskyist. But there were and are, Shaul Magid in the current day, I would say, is one of the leading voices who critiques Zionism from within the Jewish religious tradition. There were always people like that. Yeshayahu Leibovich is an important figure, began to appear already in the early 1950s and was loud and strong through the 1970s when I met him. Now, he thought he was a Zionist, which is not going to make Palestinians real happy, but every criminal act that the state of Israel committed from 1948 until the day he died, he was out there denouncing it in the prophetic voice, which many progressive Jews claim today, whether they define themselves as progressive Zionists or non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. Jewish Currents, highly recommended if you don't know about it. It is the central voice of anti-Zionist Jews, the most important place of intellectual production and debate in the Jewish community today. I totally agree with Esmat's argument that Zionism, or Zionisms, I would always use the plural, is intellectually dead. Jewish Currents is alive. And what have they done? I don't know, for the last half year or so. They have a weekly commentary on the Torah portion of the week. And Jewish Currents came out of the Communist Party. So the old folk who had closed the magazine and then handed it over to the young folk were horrified. What? Did we talk about the Torah? No, we don't. No. And they're not all to my liking. Some of them I'm more okay with than others. But as I said, Ariel said, well, if we don't have Israel anymore, well, how are we Jews? Because the Holocaust commemoration became very kitschy and not substantive either. So, okay. And I've, because I'm hanging out with the queer anti-Zionist Jews who are quite serious about their observance. So I'm signed up to chant the weekly Torah reading in synagogue on the last day of Passover, which I haven't done since I was 15 or 16 years old. But why am I doing that? well, I mean, nostalgia and my mother and all manner of things, not belief. But no one is going to say, because the people who would say it can't do it, that I'm an un-Jew or a fake. No, I'm doing the most Jewish thing there is. Eat it.
Can I just ask you one question? That, I mean, I've heard some Palestinians argue that in the wake of the genocide and after Israeli boots on their necks, it isn't possible for Palestinians to acknowledge, a Jewish national claim to Palestine.
Which is why I wouldn't ask it. As I said, if we get to the point of winning, that will only have been possible because some significant number of Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, but Israeli Jews are the more important because I'm not part of their community, not their national community anyway. They'll be there. And then they'll sort out what's going to be the constitutional arrangements. Palestinians don't have to make any statements in advance. If they want to, fine. So there was an article that dropped in Jacobin the other day by Lina Delasha and Nimrod Ben-Zeev, which criticizes the Palestinian Boycott National Committee's declaration that no other land should be boycotted. Great. I mean, okay, Lena's a good friend, not my student, but Zach Lockman's student. We're in the same bowl together there. Yeah, if she wants to do that, fine. My own former PhD student, Arij Sabah-Khoury, who was initially going to come to this conference and then for fear of repression didn't come, would also say the same thing. I don't ask her to say it. That comes from her to me and me to her, and I'm very pleased at the group of Palestinians for whom this isn't a question, and for those who can't, okay, maybe later.
Okay, thank you very much. And so should we have like a 10 minutes